And now is the opportunity to really ask the entire panel, the collective brain power of our speakers today, to answer whatever questions you might have before the close of today's workshop. So, questions? Harvey?
I don't think I need my
You'll get the microphone.
Alfred, I think when you look at the food processing sector, you're looking at a very narrow view of the food environment. And if you notice David's pyramid, there's a whole framework of things under it. That sector is a little corner there that's directly related to the consumer. So maybe it's a question for both of you. What's this going to do? Destroy trust of the consumer with the food industry or improve it? In other words, how do you talk about the food environment, but unless we have that partnership that Dave was talking about to change the food environment right from the ground up, how are we going to have a Canadian food supply that really does have an impact? So I'm not arguing about what you've learned and what you think might work as a symbol, but I'd like to see that integrated. And I think our speaker who pointed out about all the communication issues, maybe we can have some integration of that discussion. I'm sure people want to argue with you about the label, but let's start with that question of food environment and trust, because
we're arguing over who goes first.
Advances only proceed at the state of trust. So,
I'm not an thesis.
Use the microphone.
Why do you think still you're my professor, putting me out, challenging me with questions like that? All right. So Harvey was my PhD supervisor. So for those of you who don't know, you're absolutely right. Like, it's food processing sector that we're targeting. There are many reasons why we're doing that, and also that we have limitations on what we can do at this point. So I want to point out a couple of things. One, there is a recent PAHO report that mentions that Canada ranks second in terms of per capita retail sales of processed food in the world. So processed food is really like an important contributor in Canada. Second is because in terms of our regulatory environment, this is what we actually can do now. So in order for us to introduce a front-of-pack labeling system, we have to have like certain elements that meet the criteria. So nutrition facts table, we're currently proposing that front of pack would be applicable to those foods who carry a nutrition facts table because of technical and practical reasons. That doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that there is a sector out there that is not addressed by front of pack labeling or by labeling in general. But there are more complexities around addressing that sector compared to the food processing sectors. Things like, standardization of the recipes for the food, etc. If you want to put forward regulations, you want to be able to enforce them. So there is a little bit of kind of a challenge here in areas that are not related to the food processing sector, but it doesn't mean that we should not be addressing them. And I think that there are other means to be able to get at those challenges as well. And for example, when we talk about sodium reduction, we held a sodium symposium back in October where we devoted a whole day about how we're going to be addressing the issue of high sodium foods in restaurants. And so it could be that there are different policy measures, different policy interventions, different partnerships that need to be forged in order to address this type of issue. But certainly, we acknowledge that no policy is perfect. But my counterpoint to that is that if there is no policy perfect, it should not be a kind of an excuse for not putting out the policy. So I'm really interested to hear how we can basically better integrate across the different systems and what kind of policies we can put forward to ensure that we're not biased towards a particular segment or not, and at the same time remind everyone and keep reminding myself that this is a multi-year healthy eating strategy. Like, we're not trying to do everything. We already have a lot on our plate within this current mandate, so keep that in mind.
David?
Yeah, thank you. I think when we consider the policy principle of whole of government, I think there is a need to understand the implications of one policy set against other departments' initiatives and then other players in the food system. So I'm not current personally on the degree to which or privy to what Health Canada and the food processing sector, what consultations took place, what outreach took place, or anything like that. But in principle, as these policy issues do affect competitiveness, they do affect consumer choice and literacy and health. So you're spanning a bunch of departmental mandates and the system. I think that puts a greater onus on the system and the players to find the consultative mechanism that actually reflects that complexity. So in principle, as we tackle these big issues, we're going to have to change our approach to policy making to some degree to make sure that we're reflective of that. Just given though my hat within CAPI, and we did do some work on food processing, so I'm not current with the labeling, the details of the labeling issue right now, but it is a key economic driver for the country. So food processing is actually the #1 manufacturing sector in the Canadian economy by number of jobs, exceeding that of the auto and the aerospace sector. So this is a huge and important sector of the economy. And so decisions taken in one part of government around what might affect the competitiveness of that sector is a very important issue to get as right as we can, and to achieve the right health outcomes that we're also trying to achieve as a country. So that's not the or, it's the and that's an important question. So I don't know to what degree that's been tested and fulfilled, but I think as we try to grapple with these competing priorities or these very challenging priorities of competitiveness and health of the population, there's an onus on us, I think, to change the way we consult and work together and try to find the right solution. So that's a principal comment.
Yeah, I'd like to invite the rest of the panel to comment further. And I think, Harvey, you raised a really important question around trust. And how does behavior economics and cost-benefit analysis, how can that be used to enhance trust? Because potentially, by implementing new policies, we actually erode trust. So how do we know that we're actually doing the right thing? Ellen?
One way or another, I've been doing a lot of work on trust for about the last 15 years, and I've been pulling together sort of data on different levels of trust in different agents in the food system. And it's really intriguing. I mean, Canadians trust the government, and we trust farmers, and everybody in between goes up and down to a certain extent, mostly down, I guess. So one of the points made that some of the front-of-pack labeling may very well encourage the industry to respond more quickly than consumers will respond in using that information, and choice is absolutely right, because I think the industry has recognized in some cases that they don't want anything that would diminish the level of trust people have in their food at all, because they're being attacked on a number of different fronts about credibility, around sustainability, around Nestle and water use in Guelph, and a number of other fronts that is making the public suspicious of their motives in a way that we're not suspicious of the government or yet farmers. I'm not sure farmers should be comforted by their level of trust we have in them, because I think ultimately that will go too. But so it's very intriguing that these things are all interrelated. So the policies can drive changes in trust, and the changes in trust plus the changes in policy may accelerate industry responses, hopefully to the benefit of Canadian society. But we're getting, in general, more distrustful of the middle people, whether those are restaurants or food processing companies or even retailers in the middle space, about certain aspects of the food system, for sure. Technology, we're gradually getting a little bit more comfort with, but some of these other issues, there seems to be less trust by the public in Canada.
Leah?
I have a question for the section. You all three, Joanna, Richard, and Ellen, thanks very much, talked about language and communication and nudging people, but you didn't talk about tailoring the message. So 2/3 of the Canadian population have a chronic medical condition, a third are obese or overweight. But what I heard from you is, oh, let's just nudge everyone into healthy behaviors. That doesn't seem very sensible or logical to me. How do you build upon a nudge strategy but tailor appropriate messages to the target population?
Sure. Actually, I think, Richard, you asked me that question. And I mean, for the purpose of today, I mean, everything was kept at a very high level. And in fact, we get very specific and targeted with specific behavioral cohort groups. So whether it's, you know, if you're asking about people with a certain type of condition, so we would look, we'd be very targeted with if somebody has a condition, whether it's a disease or whether they have a precondition of sort. But then even within that, we would be looking at specific behaviors. So, and within, you know, and depending how that particular behavior that we're looking at, so if there are individuals who are more inclined to be very conscientious about buying and consuming healthier oriented types of products versus not, we would be looking at that specifically in the context of whether they have a precondition or disease, and then look at, you know, what are their belief systems, their attitudes, and how do they, you know, what's their motivational language, and look at it separately, and then look at where the common points are. Because what we find is there's, you know, where's the room of the commonalities? And so then it goes back to, in terms of targeting and nudging, is really from our perspective is you know, who's the research being done for? So if it's, you know, Health Canada, they're looking at it from a different perspective. So if it's a corporation who has a product or a brand that they're wanting to, you know, they're wanting to promote or market, their objective is differently as well. So you really have to look at it in that context. It's very contextual and very specific. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, I'm from the health side of the business.
Yeah.
So I actually don't care about the manufacturer, sorry. And
No, that's fine.
But 2/3 of the population, it's tanking our budget. That, you know, like, that's really important, but it goes back to what you said, David, about the activity and where health costs are. And it's not with the well people that, you know, health at the top of the thing, one-time triangle. That's 1/3 of the budget, and those are sick people, those are not well people. And so if we talk about the nudge behavior, lower socioeconomic status, or social determinants of health, that's a big player. Obesity, another big player that's linked to all the chronic illnesses. So if we wanted to target some of our energies or really nudge, is there a way to nudge in the right direction so you get the most bang for your buck?
There is. I mean, there is.
Richard, you want to comment further? Did you want to comment further?
Oh, sure.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm a big technology guy. And if you think about it, labeling is a really old technology, and it's not terribly effective. So where do I think the answer is? It's close, but it's not here yet. It's going to start with something like 23andMe. It's going to start tracking what we eat. It's going to look at your health profile. Precision medicine for when you do get ill. All of this sort of coming together, and I think it's just coming faster than we can possibly imagine. To me, that ultimately will be the answer. And where I think Health Canada is, you know, had a good start. Ultimately, the decision every consumer has to make is a holistic decision. With everything in this food, and I understand you don't want to make a legal call on it, with everything in this food versus this other food, which is the one that's best for me? And that's what you're getting at. Again, I think this is a very computational intensive thing, really big data, and it really is at the individual level. And I think it's coming, and I'm excited by it.
So does government nudge or does friends nudge? Peers?
Technology will get us there.
We have a question in the back.
I wanted to ask, and I think part of the answer comes from the last comment, how quickly would we be able to respond to a new bad guy coming on the new label that is suggested, considering all the effort that is now put into developing a system do we have a system that will evolve quickly and be able to follow whether we decide to track the bio-organic or the next step into integrating all of this very complex system. And I think part of the trust of the consumer is associated with how quickly we could respond to their new needs. So have you given any thought of how well the new logo or the new system would react to one more bad guy in the system that we want to alert the consumers to? And how would that take place?
It's a difficult question. I wasn't even sure at the beginning to whom it was addressed. So I'm just going to ask again just to make sure that I understood correctly, and I bet I didn't. So you're asking about basically how the industry would react to the symbol and how quick they could be in...
No, how Health Canada would react with a new front of package logo if we were to integrate a more complex system, or if a new bad guy in the nutritional field comes about. Because now we've targeted 3, but how about if we have a 4th one coming, or one all of a sudden doesn't become so bad after all? So
Okay,
what do we do?
now I understood your question. Okay, sorry about that. Well, that's actually a very good question. But you know, if you look at the nutrients of concern and what are the nutrients that are associated with most chronic diseases that are inflicting our society now, basically can nail them down to these 3 nutrients. And trans fat. So trans fat, we're addressing it from a different approach. So we're prohibiting that. And that's a more kind of rigorous and more kind of stringent regulatory approach compared to front of package labeling. Because as mentioned earlier, front of pack is mostly like an informational tool. It could, because of the nature of the front of pack system that we're proposing, it could have an impact on the manufacturer. Like, you know, it could, rather than saying low in sugar, which is a marketing thing, I'm going to take advantage of that, saying it's high in sugar, it's going to be, oh my God, like how am I going to avoid that? So it might nudge them towards reducing the amount of sugar in their food. So if there are other types of nutrients that come out at play, like I'm having a difficulty seeing which nutrient that would be. You know, protein now seems to be like the big, you know, in type of trendy nutrient that everything is going high. Let's focus on foods that are high in proteins. I'm actually a little bit skeptical about that because we don't really have a problem in terms of protein intake in Canada. Like, so are we really in terms of having protein malnutrition or undernourished from a protein perspective? I don't think so. So in a way, focusing on protein, would that have like some adverse health outcomes in the future? I don't know. I think that I will be in a different job and I wouldn't have to worry about it.
David, you had something
But I think that there are responsive measures that we could incorporate. It does not have to be on the label. The label is one tool, and I want to kind of also highlight this, that it doesn't all boil down to the label. Like there are many policy interventions, many policy tools that we could use to address different type of issues.
But I think what I also wanted to drive to is that trust with the consumers is also bombarded with a lot of information coming from everywhere. And if our policies are really slow in reacting, then the trust is eroded. So I'm just thinking, while you are developing this new tool for consumers, can we think of a mechanism to make it simpler eventually to change?
Yep.
Perhaps proteins will be a problem in a few years, but we don't know, and that's the beauty of science. It keeps on evolving. So.
The regulatory landscape is becoming more and more efficient. We used in the past, like with nutrition facts table, for example, when we updated the nutrition facts table, we used more modern tools from a regulatory perspective, something we call the Incorporation by reference documents. So for example, the daily values are now incorporated by reference. The serving sizes are incorporated by reference because we know that these change. Like if, for example, the the DRI committee is going to look at sodium. And let's say the DRIs for sodium are going to change, and that would necessitate a change for the daily value, rather than having to do a regulatory process from A to Z to be able to do that. And we know how long that could take. We have now measures that could make that process much more efficient and responsive. So certainly we'll look into that, as we keep that in mind as we're developing our policies around labeling.
David, you want to add further?
Yeah, I think Alfred might have answered it, but I think it's a really intriguing question because, and Alfred answered in terms that there's a broader response here. But where I just wanted to react to your question was that the package is really the platform or the vector for change. And what if, as technology becomes more precise in understanding what's in our food, how much do we load up that packaging as a means to get to the consumer? And there's only so much space before we start to confuse the consumer again, or totally, or further. So I think the caution is the food manufacturer and their package the prime target to actually get at a much deeper issue, which is essentially consumer education and literacy, which takes you into a whole different space. And so I think you really touched on the bigger question, because I think manufacturers feel a little bit under siege that they are that vector when other things need to also fall into place in order to change long-term behavior.
We'll take one more question on this side and then move on to this side, or two. Two quick questions.
Okay, I don't know if it's quick. I was trying to integrate all the different talks that we heard today, both on nudging and behavior economics, and it's too broad to actually ask one question. So this is going to be kind of directed at Richard, Scott, and Alfred. So Richard had presented a slide this morning about people looking at package label, and 50% would look at it, 50% of those might understand, and it went down to 1.5%. So then my question is, if we're using a front of pack as a nudging tool, and we look at the cost-benefit analysis of this, you know, and it has to be below $50,000 to have a value. I'm trying to figure out what the benefit would be and how you would measure that benefit, given that a particular product doesn't constitute a diet, and that there are many products that would have beneficial nutrients that may not be high in sugars and sodium and saturated fat, and yet not provide nutrients, so that we may not be able to estimate the benefit of a front of pack when it's not covering the totality of the diet. So I was just wondering whether the three could comment on that.
Go ahead.
So I'll start and give a shot. If it was my job to try and do a cost-benefit analysis of this regulation, I would start with looking at other countries who have implemented similar regulations, and then see if there has been a change in the dietary patterns of those consumers in those countries. And then from there, and it requires a lot of hand waving, a lot of economic modeling, and I would eventually get to a best guess of what impact this policy might have. Now, I don't know if this research has been done for this particular regulation, but that is how one would go about doing a cost-benefit analysis of this type of regulation.
That's the exact problem I was faced with when NLEA was passed, and it came to me and my small staff to do a benefit cost analysis. I can say in retrospect, we got everything just about wrong. We in no way, we were focused on total fat back then, somewhat unsaturated fat. We weren't even thinking about obesity. We weren't even, none of that. We weren't thinking that, you know, what could happen. We underestimated the cost by somewhere between, according to the food industry people I talked to, factors of 10 or 20. It was much, 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 much more expensive than we could have ever imagined. in retrospect, the retrospective studies have shown that we didn't accomplish much in the way of public health, and that's the end goal. It's not changes in diet, it's was there a public health outcome. Having said all that, I will tell you what if I could go back and do it all over again, and presuming Congress would let us, and that's of course never the case, I would say do pilot studies, put something out there, put it out in a province or something, measure, follow it along. Don't just throw it out there. And what happens is because, you're so busy, you just leave it out there for 20 or 30 years, and then what? Like FDA and Health Canada, well, you make marginal changes, even though if you could start all over again, and you didn't have legislators to worry about, you'd probably do it completely different. I'd rather see pilot study after pilot study, little, and then measure whether or not you have any impact. But unfortunately, most laws and regulations don't work that way.
True. So again, I want to kind of caution about jumping from one intervention to measure a public health outcome that is so complex in nature that you cannot ever try to see an impact of one policy on the whole picture. So again, I'm going to bring it back to the whole healthy eating strategy, that when I talked about that the whole is larger than the sum of the parts, is that particular kind of message that I was trying to convey. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, I'm not an economist and not going to try to be one, but I can tell you that there are kind of a rigorous process within the Treasury Board Secretariat requires for us to kind of on how to conduct the cost-benefit analysis. And so we will be implementing this, and as we kind of try to assess what are the costs and benefit, one thing that we need to take into consideration that in terms of labeling changes, it's a one cost. So you make a change to the label, and then you create the conditions to make that change to the label, and it's a one-time cost. The benefits, on the other hand, are accrued over a period of time because you may not be able to address all the benefits from labeling per se, and that is accounted for. And if you look at the nutrition labeling regs in the regulatory impact analysis statement on the cost-benefit analysis side, they made some assumptions like, it's a 1% behavior change. That's really a conservative number, 1% behavior change due to the labeling. So, but when you accrued that benefits in terms of cost to the healthcare spending, it came out actually to be a net benefit compared to the cost. So this is the type of analysis that we do in terms of when we put a regulatory measure. I do acknowledge that there is some limitations to that, but there's limitation to everything. And so when we want to try to address a public health issue, which is as big as obesity and chronic diseases that cannot be tied down to one particular factor, you have to kind of come at it from different angles, and then hopefully it's the different interventions that are going to make an impact and not a single one.
All right. Ashley, next question. Oh, okay. So we'll shift to this side of the room. Polly? Oh, in front.
Thank you very much. I apologize if my question is a duplication of something that might have been said before. Sometimes I'm lost in translation. But I acknowledge the concept of the sum of all the intervention, and I think it is, I adhere to it. My question is, because somebody talked about restaurants and labeling in restaurants. If you had a crystal ball, let's say that the policy or the strategy will be working, and that the front of package labeling will have a nudging effect more on the industry. My own prediction is more on the industry than on the customer, or yeah. How much of this intervention will have an impact on the restaurant? My question is in the fact that when Canadian or people who were exposed to TV dinners and packaged food started to eat them, they like the sweetness or they like the saltiness of the food and develop an habit. If the products are lesser in salt for example, or in sugar, is there a chance that this will influence the customer demand on the restaurants?
I would say yes. I would say that, especially with sodium and maybe sugar as well, we know that there is a kind of a consumer habit in terms of like habituation of the you know, your taste buds to the sweetness and saltiness. And one of the reasons why when we implemented the sodium reduction strategy, it was a gradual reduction, is to habituate consumers to less salty taste. So if they are getting accustomed through, you know, the different interventions that we're putting forward, and the manufacturers are actually reducing the levels of these nutrients in their food, and consumers are becoming accustomed to accept these foods that are lower in these nutrients. I think there is a potential as well that the restaurants sector would be nudged indirectly to kind of start lowering, especially if they know that there are measures that are coming at them. So, and as I mentioned before, when we put the front of pack labeling, we targeted the food processing sector, but it doesn't mean that this is, currently it might not be feasible within the restaurant sector, because there are a lot of limitations and challenges with that sector, but it doesn't mean that it's not gonna happen. And so, you know, you can see the writing on the wall, and you can start to kind of be more proactive and try to basically be responsive before you get in a position when there are regulations that need to be put in place.
All right, I saw a few other hands here. I don't know if some of the questions got answered, possibly. Okay, Ashley?
Hi, thank you. I guess I'm wondering, and I really enjoyed all these talks, I'd love to understand, from a nudging perspective, what's more effective, positive or negative nudging? And I would draw the analogy that parenting is somewhat like nudging. And we're encouraged to positively parent versus, you know, don't say, don't do this, direct them over here. So is there an assessment of if you nudge with a positive nudge versus a negative, don't do this?
You go ahead. I'm curious to see what you're going to say, because I've got a very
Yeah, and I don't think people know just yet, but in general, from the consumer research I saw, it was at least what they reported. I'm not saying there's what they think and then there's what they do. What they reported was positive nudging was what they wanted. I'm not saying that would be most effective, but that's what they wanted.
So, as I said to you, what they say versus what they do. And when you look at the unconscious language, what we find is, you heard me talk about, when I was talking about the pulses, what we found that people were moving, wanted to know what they were moving towards something, so what you may call positive, quote unquote, but, and what they were trying to avoid, so going away from. It's very contextual. We find, so your positive or negative nudging is not something that you can use in general. It's very, in all the research across categories, across industries, it is very contextual. It's so contextual in terms of the situation, the occasion, when people are making choices, that sometimes something that might be more compelling and persuasive is negative, and sometimes it's the other way around, and sometimes there's actually a specific order as well. So over the 20 years, that's what we found in terms of...
And even with your pulses, you know, you said, show them a picture of the pulses, and they don't want it. If you show them, look, you can have this delicious dish.
If that was very specific, that was very, and that's what...
Or something that's good versus eating on this thing that looks weird.
That was specific for pulses, but in other situations, that's not the case. So I just don't want you to, it's very contextual.
I would also add, like, the research that I talked about, and Mary knows more about it probably than I do, with respect to traffic light system. I mean, yes, the people, they want to be nudged towards positive things, but then when you give them the positive and the negative, they tend to gravitate towards the negative. So that I found interesting. The other thing is that from our perspective, in terms of our policy, and I mentioned that during my presentation, we're really trying to bring some balance to the front of the pack. And so the balance right now is highly skewed towards positive, but that positive is not really positive, unfortunately. And so when you see, for example, certain nutrient content claims on foods that are high in sugars or sodium or saturated fat, or health claims even on these types of products, it's not really a positive nudge. It's more kind of a marketing nudge.
So my colleagues have done a great job of giving context and nuance. I'm going to give you just pure theory. In the original prospect theory, right, from Kahneman and Tversky, the basis of it is that losses loom larger than gains. People feel a lot more strongly about losing $100 than they do about finding $100 on the sidewalk. They will do a lot more to avoid a loss than they'll do to get a gain. So that, again, zero context to that. Zero context to that. But that's what the general behavioral economics theory says.
Sure. So one last question, and we'll close out the session.
Okay, this question is for Alfred. With regards to not including an algorithm where you look at the positive nutrients balanced against those nutrients of concern, how do you wrestle with the fact that there's certain foods like dairy products, some meat products, that have essential nutrients and will carry those labels, and yet there's some empty calorie foods that won't meet those thresholds, and they will go under the radar?
Okay, that's an excellent question. In terms of some of the products that you mentioned that might have actually other nutrients, there are regulations in place that enable them to make claims about these positive attributes of food. You can say for example, on yogurt or on some other types of claim, it's high in calcium, it's an excellent source of calcium, whether it's excellent source of protein. You can make these types of claims. So that will still be enabled under these conditions. In terms of the other types of products, I'm trying to figure, I don't really know which products will be captured. If there are some products that will be minimal, because the way that we have structured the thresholds, they address also some of the products that might not be flagged by the threshold based on the 15% DV. But if there are these types of products that have small serving sizes, like I'm talking about things like, I don't know, certain breakfast cereals, for example, or certain, I'm not going to use breakfast cereals as an example, but some spreads, the chocolate spread that you find in the market. That chocolate spread will not meet the threshold for sugars, for example. Like it's not going to meet 15% DV, but it will still be flagged as a high in sugar because we created a formula that if you're a product with a small serving size, then you're going to have to adjust because your actual product is very dense in that particular nutrient. So we're trying to create an equal playing field here, not relying only on that threshold per se, but looking at the composition of the food, at the nutrient density, of that particular nutrient density of the food. So I'm not quite sure how many products that actually are empty calories or not nutritious that are going to be flagged, that are not going to be flagged by our proposal. I mean, this is something we can look at. We look at that from when stakeholders submit their comments, and we can look at how we can address this. Plus, the labeling, again, is one tool. There is a dietary guidance that's going to help also kind of guide consumers toward better choices in terms of what are some of the foods that they are encouraged to eat, etc. So it's not going to be a one-for-all policy or like any all-inclusive policy that's going to address every single issue.
Thank you. So I get to make some closing remarks now, and I'm going to nudge everyone towards some very healthy choices this evening at our opening reception and keynote. And you're going to watch? For sure.
The placement.
Oh, the placement of the food. Yeah. Now I'll remember that as well. So firstly, I wanted to thank our speakers. Please, a round of applause. We've had some really excellent presentations today. Next, I'd like to thank ILSI for their wonderful contributions to the development of this program today and continued. Next, I want to thank the attendees, you the attendees, who have been a wonderful audience today, asking some really great and tough questions to our panel up here. So a round of applause for yourself. The opening reception is going to be at starting at 4:45, so I would nudge you and encourage you to continue today's discussion at the reception while enjoying all the various amenities. We have a wonderful keynote speaker scheduled at 6 o'clock, Dr. Joe Schwartz from the McGill University. He's also well known on a number of different programs, so we have a very lively entertainment this evening. And I also wanted to nudge you further in terms of the start of the official program tomorrow. We have a further continuation of some information from Health Canada related to the food guide at 7 a.m. There is breakfast provided, so I recognize it's an early start. That's why we're providing some breakfast to nudge you to attend this very interesting session tomorrow. And also the various plenaries right afterwards. We have the Chris Gigi Boy plenary. So I do encourage you all to start your day off on the right foot and wish you all the best for the rest of this conference. Thank you, and we're adjourned.